Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce said 3 minutes before Brooke Sullivan walked through the ICU doors at St. Michael's in Raleigh, before he understood what he was actually looking at. He didn't know. Nobody knew. They were all staring at pressed scrubs and quiet efficiency, at a woman with steady hands and a patient smile, at someone who moved through the unit like she belonged there and nowhere else mattered. They didn't see the faded Navy captain's unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one she touched once before each shift, the one that still carried the smell of desert dust and diesel fuel from a valley in the Hindu Kush she'd never be allowed to name. They didn't see a legend. They saw a new ICU nurse. And that was exactly the point. Brooke pushed through the revolving doors at 6:53 a.m., the weight of her shift already settling across her shoulders like body armor. The hospital corridor stretched ahead in fluorescent white, a tunnel of linoleum and antiseptic that smelled like every medical facility she'd worked in over 23 years, that precise blend of bleach and human suffering that never quite wore off your scrubs. Her shoes made no sound on the floor. They never did. She'd learned early in her first deployment to Kandahar that footsteps announced intentions, and intentions got people killed. The ICU opened to her left, its glass walls already reflecting the pale early light, and she paused for exactly 2 seconds at the threshold, her fingers brushing the inside of her jacket where the patch lay hidden against her ribs. Captain. 23 years. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 mission that never officially happened. She didn't let any of that show. The unit was already moving, the organized chaos of a 6 a.m. shift change, nurses trading beds and patients like chess pieces, vitals being called out in urgent monotones, monitors beeping their steady mechanical rhythm. Brooke moved to the nursing station and logged in with the credentials that were real but only half true: Brooke Sullivan, RN, BSN, credentials from Johns Hopkins and 12 years at Naval Hospital Bethesda. All verifiable. All accurate. The part they didn't know was that her real assignment had come through Pentagon channels at 2 a.m. 2 weeks ago, that she'd been placed here specifically to protect one patient, that the man lying in bed 7 wasn't just critical, he was classified. The handoff report listed him as Collins, SEAL Team 3, sepsis of unknown origin, complications from a field wound sustained in Logar Province 6 months prior. 34 years old. Unmarried. Next of kin listed as his commanding officer. The file didn't mention that he'd been present for an operation that went catastrophically wrong, that he was the only witness to what happened in that valley, or that 3 very powerful people were desperately hoping he didn't survive long enough to testify. Brooke didn't read the file. She already knew everything it contained. She made her way to bed 7 without hurrying, moving through the unit with a kind of precision that came from muscle memory, the muscle memory of someone who'd threaded full lines while incoming mortars shook the floor, who'd packaged casualties for medevac with her hands shaking but her mind crystal clear, who understood that efficiency wasn't coldness, it was respect for the person in front of you. Collins was unconscious, his pale face turned slightly toward the window, his breathing synchronized with the ventilator's wheeze and sigh. She checked the monitors first, BP 104/62, heart rate 88, O2 sat 94 on moderate support. Stable. For now. His left arm bore the bandaged remnants of a surgical site, the infection markers in his blood work suggesting something deeper than what the initial debridement had caught. She was examining the foresight when she felt it, that specific weight of a stare that meant someone was watching her work with more than clinical interest. Brooke didn't look up. She finished her assessment, her fingers moving with deliberate care, and only then did she turn slightly, enough to catch the reflection in the monitor's dark screen. Dr. Pierce stood in the observation window, his white coat pristine and expensive-looking, his jaw tight as he tracked her movements. She saw his eyes. And she knew, with the certainty that came from 2 decades of reading threats, that he'd already calculated her as a problem. Dr. Marcus Pierce, 52 years old, Harvard Medical School, Chief of Critical Care at St. Michael's for the past 8 years. She had his entire professional history in her head before she'd ever walked through the hospital doors, not from a briefing, but from the kind of patient preparation that a Navy intelligence officer conducts on anyone who might intersect with an active operation. What the file didn't say, but what Brooke saw immediately in the sharp calculation of his eyes, was that he was afraid of her. Not of Brooke Sullivan, the new ICU nurse with pressed scrubs and a quiet manner. But of someone like her, someone whose attention to detail and clinical precision might expose what he'd been carefully constructing. She turned back to Collins, resuming her examination without acknowledgement. That was stage one of the game. Let him wonder. Let him see competence and assume nothing else. Let him underestimate. The morning rounds began at 7:15 a.m., and Pierce made his entrance with the kind of choreography that spoke to years of command, 2 residents trailing slightly behind him, a med student hovering at the periphery, 2 ICU nurses positioned to catch every word. He moved through the beds like a man who owned the space, his stethoscope hanging around his neck like a crown. Brooke stood at Collins's bedside, her chart ready, her assessment complete, her voice pitched to that particular register she'd perfected over years of speaking to senior officers, present, professional, completely deferential. Captain Collins, SEAL Team 3. Day for post-transfer for sepsis management. Septic focus remains unidentified despite 2 rounds of imaging and surgical exploration. Current vitals stable, but white count elevated at 18.2, lactate at 2.8, suggesting ongoing infectious process. Pierce approached the bed with a kind of deliberation that made it clear he was assessing not just the patient but the nurse presenting the information. He pulled out his phone and photographed the monitor, a habit Brooke had already noted. The photograph would go somewhere, to an insurance reviewer, perhaps, or to someone keeping records of billing documentation. 12 seconds later, she understood, he was documenting the patient's critical status for billing purposes. A SEAL in septic shock, unable to be discharged, indefinitely hospitalized. That was the kind of case that justified extended ICU stays, high-acuity billing codes, additional specialist consultations that might or might not have been medically necessary. Continue current antibiotic protocol, Pierce said, his voice smooth and authoritative. Add a vascular surgery consult, I want to rule out any central line complications. Also order an ID consult, expanded cultures, and another CT with contrast. He was building documentation. Building the case for extended care. Building the justification for charges that would stack up across months. Brooke wrote the orders in the chart with the same careful notation she'd used to document field casualty assessments. Every medication. Every intervention. Every change in vitals or clinical status. She noted the timing, the rationale, the response. Medical documentation wasn't just record-keeping, it was the paper trail that either protected a patient or exposed a system. Pierce glanced at her twice during the assessment. The first time, his expression was dismissive. The second time, she felt something shift. He'd noticed that her documentation was comprehensive and exact, that her assessment reflected not just what the monitors said but what a clinician with actual experience understood about sepsis progression. He'd noticed that she wasn't just reading aloud from the chart, she was thinking. By 8:44 a.m., after rounds were complete and the team had dispersed to their various patients and consultations, Brooke was charting at the station when she caught movement in her peripheral vision. Pierce, moving past her toward the attending physician's office. His phone was in his hand. His expression had shifted from dismissive to calculating. The room went quiet. Not suddenly, it was a gradual thing, like the sound draining from a space as everyone unconsciously registered that something had shifted. Pierce had paused at the office door. His eyes had moved to her. His jaw had tightened. For exactly 3 seconds, Brooke felt the weight of his attention, the precise moment when a threat assesses another threat and makes a decision about what to do with it. Then he was gone, closing himself into the office with the kind of deliberation that suggested phone calls were about to be made. Brooke didn't change her expression. She didn't tremble. She didn't look up from her charting. She simply continued documenting Collins's vitals with the same methodical precision she'd brought to every other patient she'd ever touched. But her mind was already 3 steps ahead, already calculating angles, already understanding that the next phase of this particular mission had just begun. Pierce had seen something in her attention to detail, and now he was going to move. Not against Collins, not yet. Against her. She was just another nurse. Except she absolutely wasn't. And in exactly 6 days, that difference was going to matter more than anyone in this hospital could possibly understand. The morning rounds at St. Michael's ICU began like every other morning, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical drone, the ventilator wheeze for critical patients creating a rhythm that most people stopped hearing after their first shift. Brooke Sullivan heard everything. She always did. The slight irregularity in Collins's breath support. The soft beep that meant his sedation was climbing too high. The way Dr. Pierce walked into the room with 4 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark, their notepads ready, their faces arranged in expressions of eager deference that made her stomach tighten. "Gentlemen," Pierce announced, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged in a room. "This is SEAL patient Collins, 38, multiple blunt force trauma, compound fracture left tibia, pneumothorax status post-chest tube, now stable on mechanical ventilation." He gestured toward the monitors with the casual authority of a tour guide. Brooke was adjusting the ventilator settings, checking the sedation infusion rate that Pierce had ordered 2 hours ago, 100 milligrams of propofol per hour, which was excessive for a patient with Collins's respiratory baseline. She'd noticed it immediately. She always noticed. "Our little rule follower thinks she knows better than the attending," Pierce said, his voice taking on a theatrical tone that made the residents glance at her. Then back at him. "Testing the social current. Nurse Sullivan, or should I call you Clipboard Susie? Tell everyone why you questioned my sedation order." The nickname hung in the air like something with teeth. One of the residents actually smiled. Brooke felt it, the small social violence of it, the deliberate humiliation designed to establish hierarchy in front of witnesses. Her jaw clenched. One measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. Collins's wife, Margaret, was sitting in the corner chair with her 2 daughters, 17 and 19, both staring at their phones with the glazed focus of people who had learned not to make eye contact in hospitals. The youngest daughter glanced up when Pierce spoke, watching Brooke with the peculiar attention that teenagers reserved for adult conflict. Brooke wiped her cheek, just once, a single tear that had escaped despite everything, despite the training that had taught her to metabolize fear and humiliation into fuel, and met Pierce's eyes. Her voice came out level. Clinical. The voice of someone discussing oxygen saturation rates. "The dosage would compromise his respiratory drive, doctor." She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. "My documentation is flawless, and we both know it." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Pierce's jaw tightened. One of the residents looked down at his notes. Margaret leaned forward slightly, confused, her fingers gripping the chair arms in that way people do when they realize they're witnessing something they don't fully understand. Brooke turned back to Collins's ventilator, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had performed this task under far worse conditions than fluorescent hospital lights. She didn't watch Pierce leave the room. She didn't need to. But that wasn't the worst part. Worst was the silence that came after, the systematic erosion of her presence like water wearing stone. 2 days later, Brooke arrived for her shift to find the unit board at the nurses' station surrounded by a cluster of day shift nurses, their voices dropping to that particular register of hospital gossip. The writing was in red marker, thick, aggressive strokes that were meant to be noticed. Written warning, B. Sullivan, unauthorized family contact with patient. Overstepping scope of practice. Creating hostile environment. No signature date. No specific incident. Just the accusation, permanent as a scar, hung where every staff member in the ICU would see it. The wife and daughters had looked confused during rounds. Margaret hadn't known that Brooke had held Collins's hand once during night shift, checking for response to pain stimulus, whispering his name because some part of the neuroscience literature suggested that hearing familiar voices could activate neural pathways in sedated patients. There was no family contact. There was only care. There was only someone who understood what it meant to fight for survival and refusing to let another warrior slip away. Brooke's hands remained steady as she read it. Muscle memory took over, the same stillness that had kept her alive in the Hindu Kush, the same composure she'd maintained through field amputations and blood loss that should have been fatal. She photographed the board with her phone, encrypted the image, forwarded it to her contact at Naval Intelligence with 3 words, "Escalation confirmed." Then she walked to the break room. The break room at St. Michael's was small, with a microwave that smelled like burnt popcorn from 2017, a refrigerator covered in Post-its, and a coffee maker that gurgled like something drowning. 3 nurses were sitting at the table, Sarah from day shift, Jennifer from nights, and Marcus, a travel nurse who'd been pleasant enough during his first 2 weeks. When Brooke entered, they stood almost simultaneously. The chair scraped against the linoleum floor with a sound like fingernails on tile. No one said anything. They just left, their body language arranged in that particular formation that meant they'd been told to. Brooke poured her coffee into a chipped mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. The coffee was still hot enough to steam. She sat down at the table, alone, and watched it cool. 30 minutes of her 45-minute break she sat there. The coffee formed a thin film on top. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee grounds filled the small space like something heavy and inert. Through the break room window, she could see Pierce at the nurse's station, his phone pressed to his ear, his other hand gesturing as he spoke. He was smiling. Not a warm smile. A smile like a wolf showing its teeth before the actual moment of violence arrives. He was looking directly at her, making sure she saw him seeing her. That evening, after the night shift had taken over and Brooke was documenting her final notes, Pierce appeared at the nurse's station with the sudden quality of someone who had been waiting for the exact moment when enough staff would be present. His voice was loud enough to carry across the entire ICU. Some people confuse dedication with delusion. He was writing something on a clipboard, not looking at her, but everyone else was looking at her. "Clipboard Susie here thinks she's running my ICU now. Interesting how quickly someone forgets the chain of command." One of the night shift nurses actually laughed. A short, nervous sound that died almost immediately. The name spread through the unit like an infection, "Clipboard Susie, Clipboard Susie," whispered in hallways, used in shift handoffs, the kind of institutional cruelty that took root in the gaps between professionalism. Brooke closed the chart she'd been reviewing with deliberate care. One motion. No rush. No reaction. She walked away, her shoes quiet on the tile floor, and that was the moment Pierce's strategy shifted from social humiliation into something far more calculated and dangerous. Because what he didn't understand about people trained in combat medicine was that restraint wasn't passivity. It was compression. It was pressure building behind a dam made of discipline and experience and the absolute certainty that if she broke character now, everything unraveled. The night of the written warning, Pierce made his first call to Gregory Ashton, a board member whose son had killed a man while driving drunk 3 years ago. Pierce had helped reframe the blood alcohol documentation. Had suggested the right specialists. Had made a problem disappear into the kind of silence that cost favors. Ashton answered his phone at 9:11 p.m., understanding immediately what was being asked of him. Pierce's voice was smooth as silk across the line. "Need to flag Sullivan's employment file. Check her references carefully. Look for inconsistencies." Ashton made notes without asking questions. This was the nature of the debt between them, it required no explanation. By the next morning, a call had been placed to the state nursing board from a voicemail left by a consultant who had concerns about patterns of boundary violations and possible mental instability in Brooke's practice. By that afternoon, Marcus Webb had been brought into St. Michael's office, a lean man with the precise movements of someone trained in investigative work, carrying a manila folder that contained selectively edited surveillance footage. The footage showed Brooke in Collins's room late at night, her face intense, her hand gripping his arm, whispering words the audio didn't quite capture because Pierce had cut the sound at the critical moments. The footage showed obsession. The footage showed violation. The footage didn't show the moment she detected the beginning of a pressure ulcer and called for the wound care specialist. It didn't show her checking his medication calculations against the pharmacy records. It didn't show her noticing that his care team had changed and his wife was starting to look less hopeful every shift. But what Brooke noticed, during a routine chart review at 2:17 a.m., was the billing. Phantom procedures. Imaging studies that never happened. Medications charged but never administered. CT scan of the abdomen listed 3 times when the chart showed it had only been done once. MRI of the pelvis charged at $4,200, the actual procedure cost $1,800, the difference buried in a subsidiary line item labeled consultation fee. Blood work billing for tests that weren't in the medical record. Over $90,000 in fraudulent charges in Collins's 4-week stay alone. Brooke photographed everything with her phone, encrypted the files with a military-grade protocol, and sent them to her contact with a subject line, financial evidence. Urgent. Then she noticed that Collins's care team had shifted. The infectious disease consult was gone. The physical therapy had been discontinued. Pierce had ordered comfort measures only, had suggested to Margaret that her husband might be better served by letting nature take its course, had recommended she speak to the palliative care team. Collins had the kind of injuries that required aggressive intervention. He had the kind of will that came from SEAL training. He didn't need comfort measures. He needed someone fighting for him every single moment. She requested a meeting with the chief nursing officer for the next morning, at 8 a.m., before rounds began. She showed up at 7:55, in her press scrubs, with her documentation prepared, her evidence organized, her case built with the same methodical precision she'd used to calculate blood loss calculations under fire. She opened the door to the CNO's office and found Dr. Pierce already sitting there, his chair pulled close to the desk, his familiarity with the space suggesting this wasn't his first conversation in this room. Beside him sat Marcus Webb, the investigator, his folder open, photographs of the surveillance footage spread across the desk like accusations made solid. Pierce smiled when he saw her. That same wolf smile. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum overhead, steady and indifferent. "Ah, Nurse Sullivan," Pierce said, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who had already won the game and was simply now enjoying the victory lap. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing some significant concerns about your performance." Brooke stood in the doorway, still in the hallway, her hand on the frame. 1 breath. 2. She did not flinch. Did not blink. And in that moment, something in her expression must have shifted, because Webb actually leaned back in his chair. The CNO looked between Brooke and Pierce, suddenly uncertain. The room held its breath. "My documentation," Brooke said quietly, "is still flawless." And that was exactly when everything started to tip toward the moment that would change everything. The medication room was silent except for the hiss of the 4 pump and the distant beep of monitors down the hall. Brooke entered at 11:33 p.m., her badge catching the fluorescent light as she reached for the controlled substance log. She needed to document the vancomycin order, the one that made no clinical sense for a patient whose culture results had already flagged ceftaroline sensitivity. That was when Dr. Pierce materialized from behind the supply shelves, his white coat still crisp at midnight, his expression carrying the weight of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. "Looking for something, clipboard Susie." His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He was close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, the cologne that cost more than her weekly paycheck. He was close enough to threaten. Brooke didn't step back. Her hands remained steady on the medication log. His cultures show sensitivity to ceftaroline. "You ordered vancomycin. Why?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Pierce's jaw tightened, not the reaction of a man caught in a logical error, but the expression of someone watching a pawn move itself off the board. "Because I'm the doctor and you're the nurse who'll be unemployed by Friday. Webb has already contacted your nursing school. They're very interested in your psychological evaluation from clinicals. Apparently you had some concerning incidents." Brooke's jaw clenched. 1 muscle. 1 involuntary twitch. That was all he got. There were no incidents. That's what makes this beautiful. Pierce's voice dropped lower, becoming something that moved like a serpent through water, smooth, deliberate, impossible to interrupt. "You can't defend yourself without admitting you remember things they claim never happened. Either you're delusional, or you're a liar. Both work for my purposes." He left before she could respond. The medication room door whispered shut behind him, and Brooke stood motionless for 47 seconds, her hands pressed flat against the cool stainless steel counter. Her breathing remained measured. Her pulse didn't accelerate. This was information. This was data. Pain was information. Betrayal was just a variant of it. But that wasn't the worst part. The night shift continued. Brooke moved between beds like a ghost programmed for efficiency, vital signs at 0100, 0300, 0500. At each check, she documented what the monitors were screaming: Collins's condition was deteriorating. Sepsis. The word carried the weight of biology turning against itself. His temperature had climbed to 39.4 Celsius despite maximum antipyretic coverage. His white blood cell count had risen from 14,000 to 18,700 in just 36 hours. The lactate that should have been clearing was climbing instead, 2.8, then 3.1, then 3.4 millimoles per liter. His body was failing to metabolize the poison that was consuming it from within. Blood pressure was the next domino. At 0230, it dropped to 88/52 despite maximum vasopressor support, norepinephrine running at 18 micrograms per minute, the kind of dose that should have kept a failing heart perfusing tissue. But Collins's cardiovascular system was no longer responding to chemical persuasion. His kidneys had noticed too. The urine output on the Foley catheter had slowed to nothing, oliguria, the clinical term for a body shutting down its waste processing because it had abandoned hope of survival. Creatinine rising. Potassium climbing dangerously high. A man circling the drain in real time, his physiology broadcasting its own surrender. Brooke documented everything. Every number. Every trend. Every piece of evidence that suggested a SEAL officer who had survived hostile fire in the Hindu Kush was being allowed to die of a treatable infection because the man running the unit was counting on his death as a convenience. At 0400, she pulled up Collins's military service jacket on her encrypted tablet in her car, the vehicle parked in the east lot where the security cameras had a blind spot and the nurse roster would show her off shift. The file loaded in fragments, redacted sections blacking out specifics that remained classified: operation designation, redacted, friendly fire incident, Hindu Kush, 2019, 6 Marine casualties, witness statement pending congressional review. In 3 weeks, Collins was scheduled to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee about a Black Ops mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. In 3 weeks, his testimony could reshape how the military conducted joint operations in high-altitude terrain. That was assuming he lived 3 more days. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she'd trained herself not to call, not to acknowledge, not to respond to during operational hours. But the message itself shattered that protocol. Mom, Commander Collins never made it to debrief. They say he's critical. He saved my life in Kabul. Please. Her son. 24 years old. Second lieutenant posted at Joint Base Maya Henderson Hall in Virginia. Deployed in the same theater where Collins had carried him out of an ambush after taking shrapnel in the thigh. Please. Brooke stared at those 4 words until the screen brightness faded to black. Then she looked back at the hospital through the windshield, the ICU wing glowing like something alive, something with its own heartbeat, something that was being sabotaged from within by a man in an Italian suit who had already decided that accountability was inconvenient. She returned at 0500 for the morning report. The meeting room smelled of old coffee and the particular staleness of a hospital where people never fully left. The resident, a young man named Patterson with the kind of exhaustion that came from 72-hour shifts, began his assessment of Collins with clinical precision, BP holding at 86/50 on maximum epi and norpi. Lactate 3.8. Creatinine 2.1. Urine output negative for the past 12 hours. We're approaching futility. The words hung in the air like a diagnosis. Futility. The clinical word for surrender. The doctors were already writing the ending. Pierce nodded slowly, his expression carrying the weight of reluctant acceptance. Continue supportive care. But I want everyone clear that we're not escalating intervention at this point. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do is recognize when the body has decided for us. He looked around the table, collecting agreement with the weight of his authority. No one contradicted him. No one questioned the fact that Collins's infection could still respond to the correct antibiotic. No one noted that the culture results had come back 6 hours earlier. No one said anything at all. The meeting dissolved. Brooke remained seated, her hands folded on the table, her expression empty. Peterson, the resident, glanced at her as he stood. "He's a good guy." "The SEAL. I saw his service records. He deserved better than this." "You're reassigned," Pierce said to Brooke, his voice cutting through the room like something surgical. "Effective next shift. You'll be covering the medical surgical floor. We need fresh perspectives on the ICU team." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He'd already turned away, already moved on, already begun his next task as if the decision had been made by forces beyond his control. She had one more night shift with Collins. One more window before the reassignment took effect, before Pierce could complete his bureaucratic destruction without witnesses who knew how to read the clinical signs that screamed sabotage. The night staff came and went, the respiratory therapist, the nursing assistant, the resident on call. Pierce did not return. He didn't need to. He'd already set the machinery in motion, already activated his contacts in the administration, already contaminated her record with fabrications that she couldn't defend against without revealing the presence of naval intelligence in his hospital. At 0200 on her final night with Collins, she stood at his bedside. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's rhythm, a mechanical, precise, no longer reflecting anything that resembled spontaneous will. The monitors painted a picture in green and red, a man whose body was being consumed by infection that the wrong medication couldn't touch. Ceftaroline sensitivity. The drug that would have worked was sitting in the pharmacy downstairs, available on every shelf, prescribed for countless patients. The only thing preventing its use was a doctor who wanted Collins dead more than he wanted to keep his license. Her son's message glowed on her phone screen in her scrub pocket. "He saved my life in Kabul." Brooke looked at the medication list in Collins's chart. Then she looked at the closed door of his room. Then she looked at the medication room down the hall, where the inventory was logged but not, in the controlled chaos of a 48-hour period of extreme clinical deterioration, always verified in real time. And that was when the real war began. The monitor started dropping at 02 for 7 hours. 42. 40. 38. Brooke was at Collins's bedside before the second alarm chimed, her hand already reaching for the call button as the rhythm deteriorated into something that looked like a heart trying to remember how to beat. She'd seen this pattern before, not in a hospital, but in a field tent in Kandahar where a Marine with a sucking chest wound needed someone to decide between protocol and survival. She didn't hesitate then. She wouldn't hesitate now. Pierce arrived first, moving with the authority of a man who'd never had anyone question his decisions. 2 residents followed in his wake like satellites caught in his gravitational pull. He checked the monitor. Checked his watch. The gesture was theatrical, precise, a small performance designed for the residents to absorb and replicate. He performed a single chest compression, then stepped back and crossed his arms. "Asystole," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "He's been down too long. Poor perfusion for hours. Time of death, 0249. The resident stepped back from the bedside. One of them, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes, looked toward Brooke as if asking permission to surrender. Brooke pulled the cardiac monitor closer, her eyes catching the faint electrical trace still visible on the screen. There was activity. Not much, but it was there. A whisper of a heartbeat in the machinery. "He has activity," Brooke said quietly. We need to let him go with dignity, Nurse Sullivan." Pierce was already moving toward the door, his hand on the frame. His wife signed the DNR this afternoon. He wanted this. Brooke pulled the chart from the slot at the foot of the bed. Her fingers moved through the pages with mechanical precision, the kind of precision that came from having sorted through 1,000 documents under fire, looking for the one detail that changed everything. Code status. Full code. Dated today. But the wife's signature was dated from a week ago, the ink a different shade, the pressure of the pen inconsistent with someone signing 5 minutes earlier in a hospital conference room. This is falsified, Brooke said. That's not today's date. Pierce stopped in the doorway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound like insects caught in amber. For a moment, nothing moved in the trauma room except the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze. Then Pierce spoke into his radio. Security to ICU. I need a security escort for Nurse Sullivan. Immediately. Brooke stepped toward the door and locked it from the inside, the mechanism clicking with a sound like a rifle chamber closing. She pocketed the key. Get out of my way, Pierce shouted, his fist connecting with the reinforced glass. The sound was dull, ineffective, the rage of someone discovering that authority had limits. You're assaulting a patient. That's grounds for. But Brooke was already moving to the supply cart, her hands reaching for sterile gloves before her conscious mind caught up with her muscle memory. The scalpel was where it always was, polished steel reflecting the overhead lights like a mirror showing her something she'd been avoiding for 3 days. She pulled on the gloves with a snap that made one of the residents flinch. The incision went vertical, below the sternum, following the same anatomical landmark she'd located in a dust storm with only moonlight and her training. Skin. Fascia. Muscle. The scalpel moved like it was asking questions and her hands were providing answers that had been written into her nervous system long before she'd ever worked in an ICU. Rib spreader. The mechanical spread of bone and cartilage. Pericardium exposed, glistening with fluid and desperately maintained hope. She reached into Collins's chest and placed her hands around his heart. The organ was still, but not cold. It was like holding a piece of someone's life in your palms, the weight of it both impossible and completely real. She began compressions, not the flat-palmed rhythm of CPR textbooks, but the deliberate, mechanical squeezing of cardiac muscle that she'd learned from a trauma surgeon in a field tent who'd looked at her and said, "Your rank doesn't matter here. Your hands do. Use them." Pierce was pounding on the glass, his voice muffled by the barrier he'd underestimated. Security guards appeared behind him, trying to override the door lock with an override code that wouldn't work because the mechanical lock was physical, deliberate, and had been designed by someone who'd anticipated that institutional authority would eventually collide with her need to save a life. 30 seconds of compressions. 45. The monitor remained erratic, the heart still trying to remember its purpose. Brooke's hands worked without hesitation, without doubt, with the terrible precision of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly what the cost of failure looked like. 60 seconds. She could hear her own breathing, steady and controlled, the sound of someone who'd learned decades ago that panic was a luxury professionals couldn't afford. Then the monitor shifted. A blip became a pattern. Organized beats began to emerge from the chaos, the rhythm finding itself like a song remembered from childhood. Brooke removed her hands and began closing with the same systematic precision, pericardium, fascia, skin, each layer sealed and sutured while Pierce's fist connected with the glass again and again, the sound like distant thunder that couldn't touch her. She unlocked the door only when the monitor showed sinus rhythm. Blood pressure climbing. Oxygen saturation improving. Pierce stormed in with 2 security guards flanking him like he was a man who'd learned to travel with enforcement. His face was the color of rust. She assaulted a patient. Arrest her. That's assault on a patient, that's. But the monitor told its own story. 118/72. Oxygen sat 96%. Collins's chest rose and fell with the ventilator's assistance, and for the first time in hours, the rhythm looked like something that might have a future. One of the residents was staring at Brooke with an expression that looked like watching someone remove a mask they'd been wearing so long you'd forgotten what was underneath. The other resident had pulled out her phone and was texting something, probably an observation that would spread through the hospital faster than an infection through compromised tissue. Pierce made a call. His voice was calm now, but the calmness had edges, like glass that looked clear until you pressed against it. 20 minutes later, he made another call. Then another. Brooke watched from Collins's bedside as the morning shift began to arrive, as the machines in the ICU continued their monotonous work, as the sun started to climb above Raleigh and the day began in earnest for a city that had no idea that everything had just changed. Within 2 hours, she was in the administration office on the 4th floor. The investigator, a man named Webb whose suit probably cost more than Brooke's entire monthly salary, had a file open on the desk in front of him. Witness statements. Fabricated dates. Handwriting that didn't match the original she'd seen in the medication logs. But attached to it all was her signature, or something close enough to it that most people wouldn't look carefully. The chief nursing officer sat across from her with the expression of someone who'd been instructed to deliver a decision they didn't want to own. Effective immediately, you're terminated for gross misconduct during a patient care incident. Brooke nodded. She had no legal defense that didn't involve revealing her true assignment, and revealing her true assignment meant Collins had no protection. The SEAL would be vulnerable. The mission would fail. Some choices don't have options, they just have consequences. Security walked her to the employee locker room. The space was empty at that hour, just rows of metal doors and the smell of antiseptic mixed with someone's forgotten lunch. She changed out of her scrubs slowly, methodically, folding each piece with precision. The fabric was still warm from her body, still held the shape of her shifts, still smelled like the hospital she was leaving. Then she carried the pile of scrubs down to the basement laundry room, moving through corridors she'd walked 1,000 times in the last 3 weeks. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead like they were dying. The laundry attendant, a woman with grey hair and eyes that had learned not to see things, didn't look up as Brooke approached the return bin. She folded the scrubs one final time with the same precision she once used to fold a flag over a casket, the fabric still warm, and placed them inside the bin. The lid closed with the sound of something ending. No one was watching. No one was celebrating. That was when Brooke understood that the real war had just begun. 3 days passed like chapters in a book someone was reading too quickly. Brooke stayed in a motel off Highway 70, a room with thin walls and a view of the parking lot, using the time to clean her encrypted phone and review the files she'd been copying for weeks, the billing irregularities, the falsified codes, the insurance fraud ledger that Pierce had been too confident to hide completely. She composed message after message to the Naval Intelligence Liaison, each one a piece of evidence that felt like building a case out of smoke and fury. On the morning of the 3rd day, she used her visitor badge, not yet deactivated in the hospital system, to enter St. Michael's at 0600 hours. The morning shift hadn't fully started. The hallways had that quality of emptiness that came just before the chaos of a hospital's busiest hours. Collins was awake. His eyes tracked her as she approached his bedside, and when he recognized her, something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude, that was too small a word. Recognition of something understood between them, a language that didn't require words. She stood there for 90 seconds, not speaking, just present. Then the commotion in the hallway. Shouting. The heavy footsteps of security personnel. A gurney moving fast, surrounded by 4 armed federal guards in tactical gear. Brooke glanced through the ICU window as they transferred the patient into the secure isolation room, a scarred face, graying beard, eyes that swept across the space and then locked onto her. The scream that came out was in Pashto, guttural and raw, the sound of someone who'd just recognized a legend in a hospital gown and scrubs. Then English, broken and desperate, "Phantom! Phantom!" The 2 Marine guards flanking his door, Gunnery Sergeant Halloway and Corporal Chen, stiffened to attention. Halloway's hand went to his radio with the precision of someone trained in emergency protocols. His eyes moved from the Taliban commander to Brooke, then back again, as if he was reading a transmission that had been waiting for 3 weeks to be decoded. Halloway pulled out his phone and made a single call. Then he walked to Collins's room and entered without asking permission. "Are you Captain Brooke Sullivan?" She didn't answer. But Halloway already had a printout in his hand, the kind of document that only came from places that kept records for reasons most people would never understand. "Captain Brooke Sullivan, Navy Nurse Corps," he began, reading in a voice that was meant for everyone to hear. "Silver Star for Combat Valor, Hindu Kush Operation, for providing medical aid to 3 critically wounded Marines while under direct enemy fire. The ICU doors burst open. Pierce entered like he was walking into his own headquarters, his face already arranged into the expression of someone about to exercise authority. But the words stopped in his throat as a 2-star naval admiral entered behind him, dress whites immaculate, for rows of ribbons across his chest, the kind of presence that made institutional rank look like something you could order from a catalogue. Brooke met the admiral's eyes. He rendered a full salute. She reached inside her jacket lining, the fingers moving to the place where she'd sewn the faded unit patch weeks ago, during nights when she couldn't sleep and had nothing but thread and muscle memory. She unpinned the captain's insignia, small, tarnished, absolutely real, and placed it on Collins's bedside table next to the patch. Assigned callsign Phantom for medical operations across 4 theaters, Holloway continued, his voice steady as stone. 2 additional silver stars. For bronze stars. Cleared for information sharing with Naval Intelligence Liaison. Pierce tried to interrupt, his voice taking on the desperate quality of someone watching their authority evaporate. This is a civilian hospital, you can't just. Doctor, the Admiral said, and the single word carried the weight of a discharge notice, a career conclusion, and the absolute end of Pierce's institutional protection. The Admiral turned to Brooke. Captain, Naval Intelligence wants to thank you for your reports on billing irregularities at this facility. The FBI has been building a case for 6 months. Your encrypted reports provided the final evidence we needed. 2 men in FBI windbreakers entered the ICU. Their badges caught the fluorescent light-like evidence photographs. Pierce's face drained of color. The blood pressure medication he'd prescribed to patients like Collins hadn't worked nearly as fast as whatever just happened to his career. Security arrived at 1,447 hours. 2 officers in pressed uniforms, their faces carefully neutral, moving through the ICU with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before. Brooke saw them first, the way their eyes scanned the unit, landing on her like a targeting system locking in. She was finishing a chart at the desk when the lead officer approached. Ms. Sullivan? We need you to come with us. Not a request. It wasn't phrased as one, anyway. The ICU went quiet. That particular silence, the one where everyone suddenly becomes very interested in their monitor screens and 4 bags. Brooke stood slowly, setting her pen down with deliberate care, the same precision she'd used to place instruments on surgical trays for 18 years. She didn't look at anyone. Didn't need to. She could feel the weight of their stares anyway, the same stares that had been cold and distant for 3 weeks, ever since Pierce had begun his whisper campaign. Now they were different. Confused, maybe. Uncertain. The walk to the locker room took 90 seconds. She knew because she counted. 1 foot in front of the other. The fluorescent lights above cast a sickly glow that made everyone look half dead. Brooke had stopped noticing that glow weeks ago. The officer waited while she gathered her things, her personal bag, her stethoscope, the photograph of her son in his corpsman dress uniform that she'd kept tucked in her locker since day 1. She didn't touch the folded scrubs on the shelf. Not yet. They'd ask for those. She knew hospital protocol. Equipment belonged to the hospital. Identity was theirs to revoke. The security escort continued through the back corridors, past the break room where she'd sat in silence while her coffee cooled, past the supply closets where she'd once believed she was invisible. Invisible. The word felt like a lie now. She'd never been invisible. She'd been invisible to them. Different thing entirely. The laundry room sat in the hospital's basement, 3 levels below the ICU, past the imaging department and the blood bank. Industrial machines hummed their mechanical rhythm. The air was humid, heavy with the smell of bleach and hot cotton. Brooke stood at the folding station with her uniform, the 4 sets of scrubs she'd worn during her 2 months at St. Michael's. The fabric was still warm from the dryer, steam rising like ghosts. She picked up the first set, the pale blue fabric soft against her hands. These hands had held Collins back from the edge of death. These hands had performed procedures that should have required 3 people, alone in a locked room, operating by instinct and muscle memory that went back further than anyone in that hospital knew. She folded with military precision. Crease here. Fold in thirds. Lay flat. The stack grew. 1 set. 2 sets. 3. Her movements were identical to how she'd folded flags, the precise, ritualistic process of taking something functional and transforming it into something ceremonial. Something final. The 4th set completed the stack. For uniforms. 2 months. 18 years of service reduced to a laundry bin marked return to central processing. Brooke placed her hand on the warm fabric for 3 seconds. Didn't press hard. Didn't linger. Just touched it the way someone might touch a closed casket at a funeral. Then she turned and walked out. The basement doors clicked shut behind her. The officer who'd escorted her was gone, his job complete the moment the scrubs were removed. She sat in her car for 4 minutes in the parking lot. Didn't start the engine. Didn't call anyone. Just sat with her hands on the steering wheel and breathed the way they'd taught her in training, 4 counts in, hold for 7, 8 counts out. Tactical breathing. Combat breathing. The kind that slowed your heart rate when everything was trying to accelerate it. 3 days passed. 72 hours of silence. Brooke didn't check her email. Didn't answer calls from the few colleagues who'd had the courage to reach out. She sat in her apartment in Raleigh, watched the rain hammer the balcony, and waited for something she couldn't name. Her phone sat dark on the kitchen counter. No orders. No contact. Just silence and the sound of water against glass. Then Collins arrived at St. Michael's at 0623 hours on Wednesday morning, but not as a patient, not anymore. He arrived as a federal transfer, unconscious, under-armed guard, with a diagnosis that made the entire trauma team go rigid, captured Taliban commander. Kandahar operations. Level for security protocols. The FBI had him in a secure room on the 4th floor with 2 Marine guards posted outside. Collins wasn't conscious. Hadn't been since the Black Hawk extraction. But his vitals were climbing, his fever breaking, his body beginning the long journey back. Brooke got the message at 08 for 4 hours. Not through official channels. Through her personal phone. A single text from a number she'd memorized 3 weeks ago, patient critical. Bedside. Now. She didn't think. Didn't question. Just moved. The stairwell was empty. The 4th floor was quieter than the ICU, fewer people, more protocol. She had no badge. No credentials. No authorization. But she had the bearing of someone who belonged everywhere, and that was usually enough. The Marines didn't stop her. Maybe they recognized something in the way she moved. Maybe they just didn't know the rules had changed. Collins's eyes opened at 1137 hours. The machinery that had kept him alive hummed its steady rhythm. His wife was in the room. His daughters. Brooke stood at the foot of the bed, checking the monitor, checking the 4, checking everything the way she'd done for 2 months before her world ended. His eyes moved. Found her face. Then went wide. Phantom. He screamed it like a man drowning. Phantom. Phantom. The word hung in the air like a bullet that had already struck. His wife grabbed his hand. Honey, it's okay, honey, but Collins wasn't talking to her. His eyes were locked on Brooke's face with the intensity of someone who'd seen her in a place where death was casual and the only thing that mattered was whether you came home. Hindu Kush. 3 years ago. A fire base under fire. A medic whose call sign was Phantom because she'd appeared in chaos and the wounded stopped dying. The Marines moved into the room. One was older, senior enlisted, with the bearing of someone who'd commanded men. He took one look at Brooke's face, the change in it, the shift from nurse to something else, and his entire posture transformed. His hand went to his pocket. He pulled out a piece of paper. Military record. Laminated. Sealed with official stamps. Captain Brooke Sullivan, he read. His voice was steady, formal. Navy Nurse Corps. Silver Star for Combat Valor, Hindu Kush Operation. He paused. Each word was its own sentence now. For providing medical aid while under direct fire. 2 Purple Hearts. Another pause. Longer this time. And a Navy Cross. The room went silent. That complete, total silence where even machines seemed to stop humming. The door opened. A man in a dress blue uniform entered, late insignia, 2 stars on his shoulders. A Rear Admiral. 2-star General. He took one look at Brooke and moved directly to her. He raised his hand in salute. Not a casual gesture. Military protocol. Formal recognition. His eyes tracked to her jacket lining, to where she was slowly, carefully, unpinning something that had been hidden there for 63 days. The faded unit patch. Navy Captain insignia. The rank she'd carried concealed, operational, waiting. She pinned it to her collar. The room watched. Collins's wife watched. His daughters watched. The Marines watched. And then the Admiral placed his hand over his heart and held it there while she stood in the center of that room, finally visible. The arrest happened in the parking lot at 1,403 hours. 2 FBI agents in dark suits, moving with the same efficient precision that security had used when escorting Brooke 3 days earlier. Dr. Pierce was at the nurse's station, his station, reviewing labs when they arrived. Dr. Nathan Pierce. The agent's voice was flat, professional. You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Brooke watched from the ICU hallway. She'd changed back into civilian clothes, a dark blazer, her hair pulled back. Invisible again, if she chose to be. But she didn't choose that. Not anymore. She watched while the lead agent opened a folder. 3.2 million in fraudulent billing, sir. Phantom procedures. Inflated stays. DME kickbacks. We have documentation of everything. Pierce's face went the color of old bone. His eye scanned the unit, searching for Webb the investigator, who'd somehow vanished. Looking for board member Ashton, who was now walking very quickly toward the elevator, his career protection evaporating in real time. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound like a bullet chambering. They walked him past the observation windows. Past the residence he'd commanded. Past Collins's room where his wife and daughters watched the man who'd told them to let go being led away in federal custody. They walked him through the main corridor, past the ER, past the ambulance bay where morning shift staff had gathered with the quiet, relentless hunger of people watching justice move at walking speed. Someone's phone came up. Recording. Pierce tried to cover his face but his hands were cuffed. He looked 20 years older. His medical license was suspended that afternoon. Revoked permanently within 30 days. 18 months federal prison in a plea deal negotiated by lawyers who suddenly seemed very tired. Restitution. Permanent ban from medicine. 6 months later, Brooke's son sent her a photo from his morning jog in Raleigh, Dr. Pierce in a blue uniform shirt loading medical supply boxes into a van marked Quick Med Supply, Equipment Delivery. The man who'd controlled life and death was now delivering bedpans. Collins opened his eyes for real at 18:47 hours that same evening. Not the startled, trauma response opening. Real awareness. Real presence. Brooke stood at his bedside, her Navy captain's uniform sharp and precise, every button correct, every line pressed. Her son's commanding officer. Her mission. The man she'd been sent to protect and the reason she couldn't fail. His voice was hoarse. Your son saved my life in Kabul. I saved his in Kandahar. Guess it runs in the family. Brooke's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted his fore. That same tremor that no one had ever seen from her in the ICU. But this time she didn't hide it. He wrote me when you went critical. Asked me to check on you. He didn't know I was already here. Collins smiled weak and true. Mason's one hell of a corpsman. Learn from the best. Through the window, Pierce's former parking space had been repainted. Staff only stenciled in fresh white letters. The old stain was gone. The replacement was clean. As if he'd never been there at all. That's what we're really fighting for. That moment when the impossible becomes inevitable. When the quiet warrior stands up and the whole system shifts. Subscribe to see the real stories behind the ones that change everything. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true name.